Tonight, a story about a railway. The longest one in the world, laid across a country so wide that a train still takes about a week to get from one end of it to the other. It is a true story, and there is nothing alarming in it. Mostly it is a story about repetition, which makes it a good story for falling asleep to. You do not need to follow it closely. You do not need to hold on to the place names, and there are a lot of them. If you drift off, the track will keep going east without you. So get comfortable. Let your eyes close if they want to. Start with the size of the problem. Siberia is not a country, but it is bigger than most of them. From the Ural Mountains to the Pacific coast is something like 6,000 kilometers in a straight line, and there are very few straight lines available. In between there is taiga, which is forest of pine and larch and birch going on for days without a break. There is marsh. There are rivers so wide that from one bank you cannot always see the other clearly. There are mountains near the eastern end, and one very large lake in the middle. And there is the cold. In parts of eastern Siberia the winter temperature routinely goes below -40, and stays there. Until the end of the 19th century, moving anything across this was a matter of rivers in summer and sledges in winter, and either way it took months. A letter from Moscow to Vladivostok might take the better part of a season. Russia had claimed this land, mapped a good deal of it, and settled parts of it, but it could not really hold it together, because holding a place together requires being able to get there. So in 1891, a decision was made to build a railway all the way across. The scheme was enormous by any standard. The full route from Moscow to Vladivostok runs to roughly 9,000 kilometers. It was to be built simultaneously from several points at once, so that different sections could be worked on in parallel rather than waiting for the line to arrive from behind. In May of 1891 the young Tsarevich Nicholas, later Nicholas II, turned the first sod at Vladivostok, at the far eastern end, and tipped a barrow of earth onto the ground. It was a ceremony, and ceremonies are usually the least interesting part of any story, but this one at least had a nice symmetry to it. The eastern end had begun. The western end was already moving. The two would have to meet, somewhere in the middle, over the next dozen years. Sergei Witt, the finance minister, drove the project forward and defended its cost, which was vast and kept growing. To keep it affordable, the engineers were told to build lightly, thinner rails, fewer sleepers per mile, gentler earthworks, timber bridges instead of stone. Build it cheap, get it open, improve it later. Much of the story that follows is the consequence of that decision. The workforce was assembled from wherever people could be found. Peasant laborers came east for wages, often seasonally, walking or riding for weeks to reach the railhead. Soldiers were assigned to construction battalions. Convicts and exiles were used in some sections, with the promise of reduced sentences for time worked. Later, in Manchuria, tens of thousands of Chinese laborers were employed. At the height of construction, well over 80,000 people were working on the line in a given season. They lived in camps that moved with the railhead, timber barracks, tents, cookhouses, a smithy, a store. The camp was built, used for a few months, and abandoned as the work moved on. Supply was the constant difficulty. Rails came from mills in European Russia and, for a period, from abroad, and every single one had to be carried to the front of the work along the line that had already been finished. That is the peculiar logic of railway building. The railway is the only way to build the railway. Everything ahead of the railhead had to go by cart, by boat, by sledge, or on somebody's back. Now, the ground. In much of eastern Siberia the soil is permanently frozen below a certain depth. It is called permafrost, and in summer only the top layer thaws, perhaps half a meter, perhaps 2. The engineers of the 1890s understood this only partly. What they found was that the ordinary rules of earthworks did not apply. You would cut a level bed through a slope in summer, when the surface had thawed, and it would look perfectly sound. Then the exposed frozen ground beneath, no longer insulated by the plants and soil you had removed, would begin to thaw in its turn, and the whole formation would slump and turn to a kind of soup. Embankments settled unevenly. Cuttings collapsed. Culverts lifted. Track that had been straight in September was noticeably out of alignment by the following August. There were also frost heaves, where water freezing under the ballast pushed sections of track upward by surprising amounts. The response was mostly patient repetition. Repack the ballast. Re-level the rails. Rebuild the embankment where it had gone. In some places whole sections were relaid several times over. It was not glamorous engineering. It was maintenance, applied at continental scale, and it never really stopped. The winters shaped everything. In much of the route the ground is too hard to dig for 6 months of the year, so the heavy earthworks were summer work. But summer in Siberia brings its own difficulties: thaw, mud, flooding, and mosquitoes in numbers that people who were there described as scarcely believable. So winter had its uses. Frozen ground is a hard, flat surface, and a frozen river is a road. Timber was felled in winter and hauled across the ice. Rails and sleepers were moved by sledge over routes that would have been impassable bog in July. Bridge piers were sometimes constructed inside cofferdams while the river was locked up under ice. Track was laid on frozen formation, quickly, knowing it would need re-leveling in spring. Men worked in temperatures at which metal takes the skin off bare hands and breath freezes in beards. They wore felt boots and sheepskin, they kept fires going alongside the work, and they took the day in shorter shifts. It was hard, and I will not pretend otherwise, but I want to keep the emphasis where it belongs, not on suffering, but on the extraordinary ordinariness of it. Thousands of people, doing repetitive outdoor work, in the cold, for years. The bridges deserve a moment. Siberia's great rivers run north, straight across the path of an east-west railway, so the line had to cross every one of them. The Eb, the Yenisei, the Amur, rivers a kilometer wide and more, carrying enormous volumes of water and, in spring, ice. That last part is the difficulty. When a Siberian river breaks up, it does not simply melt. Great sheets of ice move downstream in a mass, and anything standing in the water has to be built to take the blow. So the piers were made massive, with cutwaters angled upstream to split the ice and turn it aside. The spans above them were iron and steel lattice, designed in Russia and often built by engineers who had trained on European bridge projects. The bridge over the Yenisei at Krasnoyarsk, completed in 1899, was over 900 meters long and was shown at the Paris Exposition of 1900, where it was awarded a gold medal. It stood for a century. The very last link, the Amur Bridge near Khabarovsk, was not finished until 1916. It is 2.5 kilometers long, and it was the piece that finally made the whole route Russian territory from end to end. And then there was the lake. Lake Baikal sits directly in the way, an enormous crescent of water about 600 kilometers long and, in places, more than 1.5 kilometers deep. It is the deepest lake in the world and holds around a fifth of all the unfrozen fresh water on the planet. You cannot bridge it. You cannot easily go north of it. To go south of it means cutting a railway into a shoreline of steep rock, which is slow, expensive work. So the first solution was to sail. 2 ice-breaking ferries were ordered from a shipyard in England, built there, taken apart, shipped in pieces to Siberia, and reassembled on the shore of the lake. The larger, named Baikal, could carry railway carriages on rails laid along her deck, driven straight aboard at one end and off at the other. In open water this worked well. In deep winter the lake freezes over, sometimes to a meter or more, and even an icebreaker struggled. So for part of the year, the railway stopped at the water and everything went over by sledge. In the winter of 1904, they tried something else. Russia was suddenly at war in the east, and the government urgently needed to move men and supplies across the gap. So a temporary railway was laid directly on the frozen surface of Lake Baikal. Sleepers and rails were put down on the ice, across roughly 40 kilometers of open lake, and wagons were pulled over by horses, one at a time, spaced well apart so that the load was spread. Accounts differ on the details, and I would treat the more colorful versions with some caution, but the core of it is well documented. There is a persistent report that an attempt to run a locomotive across ended with the engine going through the ice, after which they went back to horses. The ice road worked for a matter of weeks before the thaw made it unusable, and then it was gone entirely, leaving no trace at all. It was, briefly, a railway on water. Meanwhile, the permanent answer was being blasted out of the cliffs on the southern shore, the Circumbacal Line, some 200 tunnels and galleries in about 80 kilometers, one of the most expensive stretches of railway anywhere in the world at the time. It is worth saying what the railway did, because that is the reason anyone put up with the permafrost. Before it, Siberia was reachable but not really connected. After it, a journey that took months took days. In the 2 decades either side of 1900, several million settlers moved east along the line, many of them traveling in cheap fourth-class carriages fitted out for migrants, with their tools and seed grain and sometimes their livestock. Towns that had been villages became cities. Novosibirsk exists essentially because the railway crossed the Ob there. It grew from nothing into one of the largest cities in Russia within a lifetime. Butter from western Siberia began arriving in London. Grain moved west, manufactured goods moved east. None of this was uncomplicated, and the line was built for reasons of state power as much as anything else. But the effect on ordinary lives was enormous and mostly ran in one direction. A very large, very remote place stopped being remote. The through route from Moscow to Vladivostok opened in 1904, though the final stretch on Russian soil came 12 years later. Here is the thing I keep coming back to. The scale of the Trans-Siberian is so large that it stops meaning anything. 9,000 kilometers is not a number a person can feel. But the work was not done at that scale. It was done at the scale of a shovel. Somebody dug a section of embankment about as long as a room, and then the next section, and then the next. Somebody laid a sleeper, checked it was level, and laid another one about 70 centimeters further along. There are roughly 1,500 sleepers in a kilometer of track. Across 9,000 kilometers, that is something like 13 million of them, and every single one was placed by hand, by a person who was cold, or hot, or tired, and who then placed the next one. The railway is simply that action, repeated until it reached the sea. Trains run on it tonight. Somewhere between Irkutsk and Chita there is a carriage with the lights low and people asleep in bunks, being carried quietly over ground that a man once leveled with a spade in the winter of 1898. So we will leave it there. Snow on the sleepers. The rails running away in both directions, east and west, until the trees close over them. Somewhere far off, a slow train is moving through the dark, and inside it the compartments are warm, and nobody in them is thinking about permafrost or embankments or the men who laid the ballast. That is exactly as it should be. Good work becomes invisible. Sleep well. Sleepy history, true stories, told slowly.